Go ahead, Jennifer.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. And welcome back from lunch. Hope folks got to grab some if you're in the virtual, join us virtually. So we heard this morning a lot of great presentations. And one of the things that we heard is it takes investment and planning in order to not only run a utility's day-to-day operations and meet our your core functions of supplying water and sewer service to your communities, but also to be resilient into the future and to make investments like Michael was outlining. So you may have heard that there's a bunch of money coming to Texas. There's always money coming to Texas for infrastructure and water, but there's a lot more coming through several programs. And our next speaker is going to introduce you to them if you haven't heard of them already and provide some context and background. So without further ado, our next speaker is Amanda Fuller. She has 10 years experience advancing water and coastal policies for the benefit of people and wildlife. She has been with National Wildlife Federation since 2013, and for the past 2 years has led the Texas Coast and Water Program. This is a program that is focused on water policy and advocacy in Texas, and she has spent a lot of time recently getting very familiar with all these programs and doing a lot of advocacy on all of our behalfs. So Amanda, thank you for being here today, and I will pass the mic to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. So yeah, I have the fun task of talking about money today. And I know we all kind of perk up after money is mentioned. So I'm glad we're doing this talk after lunch. And what I'm going to do is talk about some of the more recent opportunities that we're learning about now and that are kind of coming online. But I also want to kind of elevate our thinking so that we're thinking broadly, that we're thinking about innovative water projects, that we're thinking about how water infrastructure serves our communities and does myriad other things. And hopefully that framing will kind of bring you something new from this conversation. So we've talked a lot this morning about Winter Storm Uri, and it's very helpful to kind of set the stage for this conversation. You know, ironically, just days before the winter storm, the American Society of Civil Engineers released the report card for the state of Texas and our infrastructure. And it's worth noting that our drinking water infrastructure was graded a C-, wastewater infrastructure a D, and flood risk mitigation a C-. And so these aren't the best grades. If your kids were coming home from school with those grades, you'd probably be having some serious conversations about how to correct course. And unfortunately, days later, after that report card was released, we did live through kind of the reality of what that means. And it was really an eye-opening experience for many Texans, especially the half of us who went for days without running water at all or were on boil notices. And it's, you know, really important to mention that like most disasters, this one took a heavier toll on our underserved and rural communities. So I want to talk a little bit about what my organization did in partnership with some other organizations that you can see here on the left. We came together to develop high-level policy recommendations, and we spread these far and wide, but we were particularly focused on the Texas legislature as they were in session during Uri. So some of the things, and I want to go through them a little bit because as we think about funding programs, I think a lot of these elements are really relevant for the broad swath of funding available. And they're all still really relevant a year after the storm. So inclusion of best available science and data, as well as future climate projections to be included in our planning. We brought up investments in water infrastructure and emphasized the need for grants in particular, and that relates to capital as well as non-capital needs. So, you know, going back to the presentation from Round Rock this morning, hearing how important that planning, the ability and the space and the resources to do good planning for the future is really important. Household level improvements like weatherization, especially in our low income areas, ensuring that utility operators have the resources that they need to protect pipes and machinery and other equipment, prioritizing green and nature-based solutions and innovative solutions to water reliability. We brought up disaster communications. I think we all experienced what that looked like in real time. Water conservation remains a major priority for the state. So things like outdoor watering restrictions, appliance standards, repairs, and other items. And then the last item we brought up was building codes. And it's always important in terms of having a resilient community to be adhering to and enforcing the latest and greatest building codes. It's also becoming particularly important when we were looking at the ability to go after federal dollars. And so right now, for example, I'll talk about a FEMA program later, but they emphasize 2015 or higher building codes to access dollars. And so to my recollection, there was only one hearing during the regular session that was directly related to water infrastructure and exploring what happened during Uri on the waterfront. Just one, and there really wasn't much to show for it, unfortunately. We've talked a little bit about Senate Bill 3 that came out with some new mandates. That was basically the extent of what we saw during the regular session. And I mentioned this because, as you know, for better or worse, it seems as though our water suppliers are in the driver's seat when it comes to our water future. And so it feels as though there are funds kind of coming at us left and right and just sort of falling out of the sky right now. And before we talk about some of the newest opportunities, I did want to reflect on something that happened in 2021, which was the American Rescue Plan Act. These are federal COVID relief dollars that were sent from the federal government to states. There were, if you look at the top of this table here, once you move beyond the state of Texas allocation, you'll see that there are billions of dollars of direct allocations to cities, smaller governments, and counties. And that's important because when you're in this middle box here, the fourth bullet, you'll see that making necessary improvements in water and sewer infrastructure is an eligible use of the ARPA dollars. So if you're in an area and you haven't had conversations yet with city leadership or county leadership about what they're going to do with their ARPA funds, now is a great time to be approaching them. I've been hearing recently that Hays County, for example, is discussing the potential of using some of their ARPA dollars for various water projects. And so I hope, folks will take that opportunity to make those connections and see if there's any opportunity there. I also want to mention that we worked really hard to persuade the state legislature to prioritize water infrastructure with that top item, the $15.8 billion, which was an allocation to the state. And the governor directed our legislature to take that up in a third special session, which happened in October of last year. Our state legislature declined to prioritize this eligible element of water infrastructure in deciding what to do with that nearly $16 billion. And this is unfortunate because it was no secret that Texans were overwhelmingly approving of ARPA dollars being used on water infrastructure. So this is some polling done by Texas 2036, and it showed a whopping 88% of folks in favor of using almost 20% of this money on water infrastructure. And surely those polling results are related to our experiences with Winter Storm Uri. But still nothing from our state legislature. And the refrain that we heard was a reliance on the federal infrastructure bill that was coming down the pipeline. And, this was in October of last year, and that bill was on really shaky ground at that time. So they were really, bargaining, relying pretty hard on this idea that this bill was going to come through. And when I try to think about some lessons learned out of the third special session and what our state has done with the ARPA funds, a couple of things come to mind. I wonder how much our lawmakers were hearing from our water suppliers ahead of bill drafting, because on the first day of that special session, the bill was pretty much fully baked. And there were a few amendments made to it as they heard public testimony. But I really wonder, were we there fast enough? Did we get in at the right time? Do we have lawmakers who are educated at the level that they need to be about the state of our infrastructure and kind of the direness in some of our communities to correct course? I also think a lesson learned out of that was that during public testimony, the water community didn't show up enough as it probably should have. And there were other sectors, advocates from other sectors, just really kind of pounding their points home day after day in these hearings, and they were successful. So those are a couple lessons that I took away. And this is important to think about, because again, thinking about the anecdotes out of Round Rock this morning, political will played a really big role in being able to have the latitude to spend dollars on infrastructure and do necessary planning for the future. It's also important as we think about what everyone wants to hear about, which is the federal infrastructure bill, formerly called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I wanted to just pause here for folks to actually look at the text on this screen, even though it's a lot, to just acknowledge that the administration and Congress are really coming together around a common challenge, which is this overall underinvestment in our water infrastructure that has gone on for far too long in our country. So we've got lead pipes, water main breaks, PFAS, wastewater management systems kind of failing. And when you couple all of that with long-term drought, water shortages, the impacts of climate change, all of that collectively has really laid bare this issue that we have in underinvestment in things like water reuse and conveyance and storage infrastructure. So the administration and Congress's solution to this in the infrastructure bill is the allocation of $55 billion for drinking water, wastewater, water reuse, conveyance, and other infrastructure. And I'm going to talk more about specific points going into the state revolving fund for our state a little bit later, but it's also worth noting that's not on this slide. It's just the real intense focus right now on underserved and disadvantaged communities and emphasis on grants and technical assistance. And so that shows up through and through in the bill language. So a breakdown of that $55 billion is on this screen into specific programs. And so there are several that the state of Texas will benefit from. The one I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into is the drinking water and clean water state revolving funds, because we know a little bit more about how that will roll out this year than we do about some of these other items. And we are still awaiting guidance out of EPA specific to the SRF funding, but the administration did recently release a guidebook. This is the cover of it, if you want to go check it out online, for the legislation as a whole. And before I get to SRFs, a couple of important points that I wanted to call out is that in the bill for lead service line replacement, there is no state match required, and 49% of that allocation needs to be spent as grants. And then for PFAS remediation, again, no state match and 100% needs to be spent as grants and forgivable loans. So thinking about Texas specifically and the Drinking Water and Clean Water State Revolving Funds, 2.9 billion is going to flow out of the EPA into those funds in Texas over the next 5 years. And so that will be for wastewater, reuse, stormwater, general water infrastructure projects, among other things. And in 2022 alone, the state is allocated more than $500 million for SRF programs. And on average, that's about $100 million more than we're used to having in those two SRF funds. And it's important to note that because $100 million is a significant increase, it is also going to be the lowest dollar amount in this first year compared to the next 4 as the program completes its 5-year course. So these things will be going up year by year. The Texas Water Development Board is charged with facilitating the SRF programs, and so they will be administering this funding. Nearly half of this money, 49%, will be administered as grants and forgivable loans. And that's a far greater percentage than we're used to seeing in our state for SRF funds being used as forgivable loans or grants. The state has to match this to the tune of 10% to access it in 2022 as well as 2023. And this is actually a decrease from the usual 20%. However, that 20% match requirement comes back in years 3, 4, and 5 of the program. Local communities will need support for pre-planning and technical assistance, and the EPA has made some commitments publicly to this piece of it, but we don't quite know what that looks like yet, and so we're hoping that will be illuminated in the guidance to come. A very important deadline coming up, though, is March 4th. So anyone interested in pursuing these SRF dollars through the board need to have their project information form or their PIF turned in by that date through the board's website. So I do want to take a step back and talk about some other federal opportunities. There are really good programs underway. And if we are able to kind of expand our thinking about the role that our water suppliers, water utilities play in our communities, I think we can grab at some broader conceptual ideas going on, like climate mitigation and community resilience, but really that kind of community lifeline framing of the services provided by water suppliers to our communities, the ability to make a community more resilient on the front end as they encounter things like disasters, and even in some cases, aid in climate impact mitigation and disaster preparedness, especially when you're providing services from a more green or nature-based infrastructure solution, then a bunch of different funding programs open up to you. So a new one that I wanted to go through as an example is FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC. BRIC is really interesting because it is not dependent on annual congressional appropriations. However, there is a variability to this in that the corpus of the BRIC program is funded by a 6% set aside every year of supplemental disaster appropriations. So in years where there's not a lot of supplemental disaster appropriations or not a lot of disasters, we'll see a smaller corpus, and in years where there are more, there will be more money in that pot. For example, in FY 2020, this was the very first round of the BRIC program. FEMA had $500 million in a national competition pot. So every state territory receives a modest amount of money every year as a direct allocation, but then we can all compete nationally for these funds. The top 2 items that received the most amount of funding in their first year were flood control and utility and infrastructure protection. And then it's important to note that President Biden added another $1 billion into the BRIC program in 2021. And so they recently closed out an application period at the end of January for the second round of funding. The next round will come out probably in August, September. So no vote, notice of funding opportunity. And then that idea, I believe, will close again at the end of January in 2023. So keeping with this line of thought of thinking about our water utilities and supply as community lifelines, thinking about community resilience and that pathway of green infrastructure, all of this really does open up a whole new world of funding sources. So if you can focus on and articulate, in addition to the normal services that are provided through these types of projects, but articulate the benefits to water quality or economic and community development, our rural areas and underserved areas, the role that they play in disaster recovery or mitigation, to the extent that transportation is involved through things like stormwater. And then even in some cases, conservation and ecosystem restoration benefits can be articulated from these projects. So when you can do that, you can look over at these on the right-hand side, all these different federal agencies that have programs relevant to these types of benefits. And then I also want to share with you all the perspective from our NGO community in Texas. And so our organization has been coming together with other conservation organizations and environmental groups, as well as rural water organizations and equity organizations. And we're all really aligned around four main principles, which is grants, innovation, resilience, and equity. And so to the extent that anyone wants to talk about those things with us, the groups on this slide are more than willing to be there for you. So in summary, big item to do coming up is just that PIFs due to the board by March 4th. If you want to try to take advantage of this first round of the federal infrastructure dollars, this influx into our SRF programs. Secondly, think broadly. Climate resilience, that community lifeline framing, the emphasis on innovative solutions like green and nature-based infrastructure, all of this opens up myriad possibilities for unique funding opportunities. And then it's important to engage the community from start to finish, especially if you're thinking about more innovative projects and what folks want to see on the ground in their community. And I'll repeat, the phrase that we often hear from communities, which is nothing about us without us. And I think many of the funding sources, specifically on the federal side, are looking for that engagement piece to be proved up in applications. And then lastly, lean on your NGOs. We are here for you. We want to be your partner in securing funding. And we're really good conveners. We can reach stakeholders and help you do any type of engagement that you're interested in. So I will stop there and share my contact information, and I welcome any thoughts or follow-up questions.